Good afternoon. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn talk series here at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. We do these once a month. If you're a frequent flyer, welcome back. And if you're new to us, welcome here today. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Executive Director for the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. We're a nonprofit organization based right here on the Stonington Harbor, working throughout the region on really important issues. Our mission is to help sustain commercial fishing and the communities that depend on that. Our work crosses over certainly into other kinds of the seafood sector. And we're all about engagement of community members like yourselves. So thank you for being here. The work that we do here at MCCF, we fit into three elements that interact with one another. One is called collaborative research, and then collaborative management uses those findings, we hope, for progressive types of management approaches. And then our third theme is collaborative education, where we want to help prepare the workforce, decision makers of the future, to help manage the system that we're all so interested in. And today we're going to highlight part of our collaborative management work. And many of you have probably met Mike Thalhauser before, but it's great to have him here. He's our collaborative management specialist. He'll be sharing with you an update on his work with the River Herring Network and the work that goes on with the alewife fishery, which is just now beginning to run here in our part of Maine. I hope you get a chance to get out into the waterways and see these fish for yourselves. It's just an amazing experience to see that, and the work that we do around that fishery is really very emblematic of our interest in ecosystems and the connections between freshwater and saltwater systems. So Mike will touch on that over the next hour. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A function or the chat function, and I'll stay behind the scene here and come back and help to moderate Q&A at the end of the hour. You'll be seeing a bunch of different types of images throughout the day. So just understand that depending on your bandwidth, there may be a little bit of irregularity in videos, but Mike's got a whole bunch of great images to share with you, and appreciate you being here. And I'll hand it over to Mike Thalhauser.
Great, thanks, Paul. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, Paul, for that great introduction. Again, my name's Mike Thalhauser. I'm our collaborative management specialist here down in the harbor in Stonington, Maine, and get to work here. I focus a little bit more mainly on the Blue Hill Peninsula that's just surrounding us, and in eastern Maine. And being the collaborative management specialist, or what you'll hear us talk about as co-management, a lot of people have the initial question of really what is co-management, and in its simple terms, it's taking a joint commons, commonly owned resource, and then managing that with multiple partners. And that sounds again simple, but when you're dealing with universities, researchers, you're dealing with different levels of government, from local to state to even federal and tribal. And our focus, which is on those users, the fishermen, the community members, the people that really, where the rubber meets the road, and try to bring those pieces together, it gets a lot more complicated. So, a lot of people will try to pick this apart and look at the functional aspects or the legal aspects of how do you, make decisions with this person and this person when they have different obligations and roles. And really looking at it that way can be problematic. Instead, it's easier to look at this as an iterative kind of system that is more of a problem-solving process and a relationship and a deliberation, negotiation that requires the same thing that any relationship requires: trust, communication, and is something that isn't one single model, and there's not one specific things that work. It's got to be different for each species or each issue that we're dealing with, and has to change over time. And what do we get from that? A lot of people will ask is when we bring in all those different users into that decision-making process, we get more and more capacity. And that's where this concept of networks that we'll talk about really becomes essential in bringing those pieces of different parts of the capacity together. And like Paul mentioned, I'm going to be talking about alewife, a species of, you'll hear me talk about river herring and use those terms kind of synonymous. Alewives are a species along with blueback herring and shad sometimes that are termed river herring because of their life history and their relationship to other herring species. So we'll focus again a little bit, they'll do some background on alewives, river herring and their life history, how that fits into it, management, where we fit into that, and then talk about those networks that MCCF really connects with and tries to create to be part of that collaborative management. So again, getting into life history, alewives or river herring are a species that are a perfect example of a species that needs this type of network and added capacities together to really make management function. There's species, you can see my little cartoon fish here, that right now, as Paul mentioned, are returning to Maine streams and rivers and ponds to spawn. So they return into these freshwater systems from the open ocean to go up into our coastal streams, into our freshwater ponds that are right in our communities, and they show up right around now. And for the next month or so, we'll be coming back. They spawn in our freshwater ponds. They're broadcast spawners, so they basically all go into the pond and they get in big groups and lay sperm and eggs in different parts of the pond. Those eggs settle out and spend a month or so before they start hatching and rearing in those freshwater environments. And the adults pretty much take off as soon as they spawn and head back out to the ocean for the majority of their lifespan. They come back at around 3 or 4 years old at maturity and could come back multiple times until they're 7, 8, and sometimes even 9 years old. The juveniles around anywhere from July to August, September, and October will start funneling out of the ponds after rearing and feeding in those freshwater ponds, and will stay in the estuary for a year or up to 2 years in our freshwater estuaries before making big migrations up and down the East Coast, commingling with other herring species. And so again, you can see these fish really span the entire East Coast and bring in a whole lot of states and a lot of different interested parties into how they're managed. It's also worth noting those dark red kind of burgundy spots in this this diagram that shows where river herring occur, alewives occur, are places where they're invasive, and that can actually be a problem. So most of those are the Great Lakes and places that don't have coastal access. And again, another reason why this is such an important species and a good species to look at is because of their history of fishing and kind of what's occurred in this fishery. And so alewife were a huge number of fish that were out there, were really a big part of commercial fisheries and part of the food chain. And because of dams and overfishing, we're very much on the decline, and you can see landings down almost to zero in the mid-90s. And because of the restoration work and the other focus on river herring have since had a rebound, and I would argue that a lot of that is because of the networks and different types of people that have been involved in river herring management. So getting into the nuts and bolts of that management and where the different pieces and angles come at it, alewives are managed at really 3 different levels. And they have, each of these levels have different, I guess I would say, capacities and values and different things that they can do and kind of pros and cons as we kind of move around. So at the federal level, you know, that pink band that you see, river herring, alewives span all these states. And so at the federal level, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is in charge of managing this species. And so this is a level at which every state where they occur gets kind of an equal vote in how they're managed, which comes with big capacity when it comes to the research scientists, managers, and abilities at that federal level at NOAA and places like that. But it also comes with really limited ability to do specific things. So there's really, really blunt tools that can be very effective, but don't get to some of the minor things that may need to happen because of a socioeconomic reason in a particular state or a particular region. So the federal government's been really good. When you saw that big dip in landings and things like that, they were able to say, look, there's a problem with this fishery. It looks like it's being overfished. There's some connectivity problems. We really need to do something about it. And they were able to create a moratorium on catch of river herring as bycatch and as other commercial fisheries. And so we're able to do things at that really blunt tool. But again, different states have different issues, and that's where states come in. So that's when we bring it down to the state of Maine level, where we've got the Maine Department of Marine Resources that manages them. And we also have the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Alewife are kind of complicated, again, because they go back and forth in this boundary of fresh and salt water. And so when they're in fresh water, they're juveniles, they're managed mostly by the Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife. And when they're on their way back or forth, or they're in the marine environment, they're managed by the Department of Marine Resources. And again, communication and that relationship between even state agencies plays a role. And again, maybe a con at both the federal and state level is there's limited numbers of employees that can actually be focused on this. So even at the state level, when we're getting a little bit better than the federal level at that, what's the right scale question, we're looking at 5 or 6 full-time employees at the Maine DMR that are able to work on alewives in the anadromous fish department. And we've got 3,000 miles of coast and countless number of river herring streams and ponds. And so that's where this local level of capacity, these municipalities and towns that see these fish coming back into their ponds and streams every year and have that local knowledge of what these fisheries have been, were, are, and can be, really comes into play. And that's where we worked with local towns to form alewife committees and to really bring to bear that capacity that comes at that local level. And that Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries really works across those boundaries. We call ourselves a boundary organization that can understand these different levels, the capacities that come with them, and really the obligations and benefits of each of those levels, and try to create communication and trust and transcend some of those boundaries for the betterment of the fisheries and for our communities that we represent. And so that's a species kind of dive in. And now I'll look a little bit more close at the geographic region that we've focused on when it comes to alewife management and research, and where some of these local networks that I'll talk about come into play as we kind of move through the presentation. So this is the Blue Hill Peninsula, where we have 3 towns that are in our scope of work when it comes to local alewife management and research and monitoring. So those are the towns of Penobscot, Brooksville, and Sedgwick. And we've got 5 ponds that when this work began, or before this work began, had hosted alewife populations. So Frost Pond, Walker's Pond, Parker, White's, and Pierce's Pond in each of those 3 towns. And you'll see that up until about a year ago, and even before that, there were these little red lines where barriers in streams where fish just simply couldn't get past. There were some issues in some of the other ponds, but this was a estuary that was not up to its full historic capacity of river herring passage. And so along with other partners, we worked with these 3 towns of Brooksville, Penobscot, and Sedgwick to help create alewife committees, people, smaller groups that are in these towns that were focused on river herring restoration and monitoring and management. There was one when we started in Penobscot, and since then we helped create committees in Sedgwick and Brooksville. And then it was bringing these communities together in this building, 6 years ago or so, and sitting down with folks and listening to what they wanted to see happen, and try to dig into what their local knowledge and capacity was to try to find out what these local goals would be. And so the 3-town alewife, which the 3 towns sort of came together to create as a whole, created goals that were basically to monitor all alewife populations in the Bagaduce, to restore access to all the habitat where alewife existed before, to restore fish. You can make access, but that doesn't mean there's fish there. But so to bring fish back to those ponds where they used to be, to manage those populations locally, to open non-commercial or recreational, some people call it, harvests of Walker's alewives. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, and to make this all sustainable as a long-term goal. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into each of those. So monitoring when it comes to river herring basically amounts to doing physical counts of fish and then looking at biological sampling that tell different things about the health of a fishery. And in the end, when in this co-management piece is where luckily in the state of Maine, we have a system that's more of a formal system than most fisheries of co-management, where towns can actually, if they can prove that they have a sustainably harvestable population of river herring, can actually help create it with the state of Maine, create a management plan and be able to manage a commercial fishery of those fish. And so to be able to prove that you've got a sustainably harvestable population, you've got to, first of all, count fish. And so you can see up in the top right corner here, one of our volunteers with a little pitch counter, just clicking away every time he or she sees a fish. And sometimes they're cruising through so fast, you're counting by tens with a clicker, and sometimes it's a little slower than that. Honestly, sometimes it can be in the multiple thousands in a half an hour. So we count 4 times a day when fish are running for 30 minutes every day, and then extrapolate those numbers out for a run estimate for each year. And then to further look at the health of a fishery, we take different biological sampling. So we measure fish, we determine whether they're male or female coming back. And then one of the most important things is taking scales from these fish. And that tells us a few different things. One, it tells us how old the fish are. You can see this picture of a fish scale where you can actually read their scales like a tree ring and see how old they are. And with river herring, you can actually tell the difference in each ring by how close they are together, whether they've spawned in a certain year or not. And that can tell us how many times an individual fish has spawned and whether it's come back over and over again. And that can actually tell us a lot about whether or not fish are getting out after they spawn, or whether the juveniles are able to leave. So if we don't get repeat spawners, as we call them, we know there's some kind of issue with adult fish leaving. And so there's different parts about the stream and the system that we can tell by that. And in the end, you come up with these graphs and ways to show how populations are doing. The ones with little bars there that you can see are basically numbers of fish, and we can use established state and federal kind of guidelines for what sustainable is. That's represented here by the blue line going across the screen, which is a certain number of fish per acre, as what's kind of a guideline benchmark for fish that we want to see in ponds. And you can see for most years in all these locations, we're above that. And then the little jagged lines are mortality estimates that tell us whether or not the fish that are coming and going into these ponds are experiencing any sort of undue burden, maybe caused by a fishway or something else in that system that's reducing their chance of survivability and might point to a lesser of a sustainably harvestable population. And luckily these are all good. And it takes, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but it takes about 10 years of data for one of these towns to be able to participate in a commercial fishery that really ends up being, in a lot of these cases, the lifeblood for a population, when it takes so much work to keep these streams open and fish running. Really, a lot of times it takes some sort of incentive for a town to be involved in being part of this process. And so a lot of work really goes into this that we'll talk about as we move along. Along with this work that towns do in these fisheries comes a lot of and honestly, with whether it's the lobster fishery or a scallop fishery, when people are out interacting with these species, whether it's commercial fishing or just seeing them and counting them, whatever it is, you end up with time and observations and questions about those species. A lot of times those questions and observations are a lot more at a finer scale and more informed than what you would think even researchers and academic folks can come up with. And so a lot of questions really have developed and were there before we were even here by community members and folks involved in these fisheries. And so we were able to work with that local knowledge, those questions that come up, and develop them into more collaborative research questions that we were able to help answer for practical use. In the left picture, you'll see me working with some of the alewife committee members in Penobscot and Sedgwick on creating a pit tagging research program where we were able to, as part of one of the fishway restoration projects, where a engineer said, oh, you know, fish can't get past this certain barrier in this stream. And as a feasibility study was being designed for a fish passage project, folks in the town that have been here for a lot longer than an engineer that's looking at this on just kind of a, you know, in a book sort of and elevation kind of scale, was saying that these fish couldn't make it past a certain barrier. Folks in the town were like, well, they've always made it past there. So we were able to design a pit tagging, or pit is short for a passive integrated transponder, or basically an easy pass system, where we were able to put these little tags inside of fish and put an antenna above where a barrier was and be able to show that fish were actually able to make it past this barrier and save a fish restoration project hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the middle and the right pictures, we're looking in ponds in the middle, and on the right in an estuary, looking at different aspects of life history that are working here. In the middle, it's looking for juvenile alewife that we're using purse seines to collect, to be able to tie some of the work being done in counting to be able to tie that into, you know, how many adults turns into how many juveniles, and what the real productivity of a system is, and why that might be different in one pond to another. And in the right picture here, we're doing some beach staining, where we're looking at habitat use in the Vagaduce estuary, and what important habitats these fish are utilizing throughout their life. And in other cases, we were able to look at other really practical solutions. In Walker Pond, since about the 1980s, the fish in Walker Pond were a lot smaller than most alewife streams, and were even classified as something of a novel term called pygmy alewives. And so these fish were smaller, and they ended up being classified as kind of this special fish, almost like you being used as like a subspecies that required some sort of added protection. And again, local knowledge said these are just the same alewives that have always come back to the system. And we were able to, here's my kind of cartoon of really the situation there is, you know, what were these things? Well, let's find out. Let's find out what the reason is here. And so we were able to ask that question at a deeper level and say, are these fish smaller because, you know, the food's different? We were able to work with the University of California, Santa Cruz, and take genetic samples and say, is there a genetic issue? We were able to look at ear bones in the top right picture that you can see there to find out whether the fish spent more or less time than normal alewives, that would make them be smaller, and really find out if this was a big deal. And we're able eventually to say, nope, these are just smaller fish than most, and we're able to bring back a recreational harvest in 2021. And if you can remember, that was one of the goals of the Alewife Committee. And then really to dig into other work, usually I save beavers for the end of the talk because they end up being so controversial and end up getting so many questions. But even just like a concrete dam could, beaver can interrupt river herring as adults or juveniles from entering or leaving fresh or saltwater habitats. And so notching of these dams is often required, and honestly takes hundreds of hours of community work to be able to keep that passage moving throughout the year. And you know, when you think about it, this is that kind of capacity that you really can't even think about having at the state and federal level. And it's only at this local level that you could be able to make it out to, and I'm actually going out to a dam after the talk here to help out with some of this fish passage work, to be able to go out there sometimes every day, every other day, to be able to allow juveniles or adults to pass some of these dams. And another one of those goals was restoring access. And here's just a couple pictures of some of the projects that were led by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, along with other partners and funding. These are two examples and of fish passage projects. And whereas you can see on the left of both these side dams that were keeping fish from going back and forth between fresh and salt water. And with with amazing fundraising by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust and good project leadership, and really by them being the great partners they were and working at this level, the local level to do these projects the way towns wanted to see them done, we're able to restore passage in these 2 ponds and improve passage in all the ponds of the Vagaduce estuary and bring that work together. And one of the other goals you'll remember was, not just bring back fish passage, but bring back fish. And so in partnership with the Maine Department of Marine Resources, we were able to do local stocking. Usually fish are trucked in from other places, and members of our alewife committees were very adamant on, if we're going to bring back fish in the Vagaduce ponds, we want to have Vagaduce fish reintroduced. And so we were able to collect fish from Walker Pond, the biggest producing system that we have, and stock those into Frost and Parker ponds that hopefully will be online very soon. And actually last year was the first year that we had fish coming back from these stocking efforts, and these fish were about a month earlier than we were on fixing this fishway at in Snows Brook coming out of Frost Pond. And so we actually had to go out and dip fish over a culvert that was replaced later by this effort, again led by Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And so this is us dipping fish coming back into a culvert that is now passable but wasn't before. And again, the other piece was really the sustainability of this all and thinking about the future. There's in most of these communities and in these efforts, there's several key members that are leading this work and that are a big part of it. And the truth of the matter is, if you take them out of the equation, this all goes away unless we can make this sustainable and bring future generations along. And so one of the other big pieces of this work in this sort of more local network is thinking about the future and getting our kids out there from our schools, seeing these streams. You can see in the picture on the right above that little piece of wood the kid's standing on, that's keeping fish into the fishway. You can see this bottom of the stream there, and you can see how black it is to the left, and that's just the backs of fish that you can seemingly walk across. And just getting those kids out there to see that and to reach in and pull out a fish and see what these runs really are, is what it takes to bring up the future stewards of these fisheries and these communities. And those values, whether these fish are commercially fished and used for bait or food, or they're used for, whether it's lobster bait, halibut bait, whether they're, looked at as food for eagles and or otters and other species, those values end up being the capacity that these communities have and that we need in this system of co-management. And that was just kind of a deeper look at those local values. But when we're really talking about co-management and this network that we're trying to foster and to create, it's the local communities, and that's where MCCF is really dialed in and trying to bring it out. But there's also, the government entities. There's the Maine DMR and Inland Fish and Wildlife and the federal government. And there's the other nonprofits in the area, whether they're land trusts or other environmental NGOs, or the universities and researchers. And for this all to work, connections have to be created between each of those, and trust has to be, and communication has to be part of that. And so these red lines are kind of where I see MCCF fitting in to help support these networks. And I think that's somewhere where MCCF again has a unique role in being able to understand these systems from all the different angles that they're coming at these fish from, and they're, again, like the capacities that they bring to bear, and to understand those state and federal policy conversations to try to incentivize that lesser understood local capacity that we see in our communities, and to stand that policy up and that work up and create new policies. And as part of that work, this is something that started with a canoe trip with a partner of ours at Manomet, which is has been a very adamant collaborative management partner with us and with others in the Down East Fisheries Partnership that we're all a part of that group, was saying, we've seen these local things work in bringing together state agencies and local folks and researchers. Why can't we do this on a broader level? And so over a year ago now, we were able to say, let's just mash these people together and start meeting and bringing them together to find out whether or not we can create a network around river herring that'll really be a broader, I guess, relationship of all those different parties and start bringing together people. And so we've had several meetings now, I think 5 at this point, that are represented in this picture to the left that kind of shows the different stars and circles of where people are coming into this, whether they're a university, a state agency, a local alewife committee member, a fisherman, what have you, to start bringing folks together and start focusing on different pieces like collaborative research projects, utilizing each other's knowledge and capacity to work on these difficult issues. And we've seen a huge response. Like I said, we've had 5 or so meetings now of about an average of 35 to 40 participants in each meeting, and have really gotten positive feedback and a strong focus. This year is our first year working on some specific collaborative research projects around looking at temperatures and when river herring come back and how that correlates to water temperature and things like that. And one of the other pieces that's come out of this network was that that communication piece is really important in making this type of network work. And so along with our partner Manamet and with all the participants here, we've been working on creating a website, a web portal to facilitate that management between entities and between parties, and to be able to access more information and more data for whether it's research or management or just someone getting into restoration or some other piece of this river herring work. And so this is just kind of a screenshot of a homepage that's under development that's really is becoming hopefully a really useful tool for our members and other folks working in this space. And then that being kind of a bigger scale network that's even more New England than it is Maine, I wanted to bring up, this is sort of following up on the sort of not lower level, but smaller scale network that's happened in the Blue Hill Peninsula that is in the restoration world, is being led by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust in the collaborative management and research, MCCF bringing that in, but focusing on again, that capacity at the community level and what it takes to really achieve success in this work at this kind of scale. And so those local networks that are bringing the same sort of partners together and achieve success is a really cool thing to see, and it's really what makes things move forward. And with that, I'd like to show a trailer that is just a couple minutes that you'll see shows this kind of work of this will eventually May, I think 15th or maybe 21st. It says at the end of the video, but is going to be our showing date of a little bit long, like a 30 or so minute video documentary of these local efforts. So Tate, if you're on there, you can go ahead and show our trailer that Maine Coast Heritage Trust and MCCF have, and Tate actually put this together as our film guru. So I'll let him kick this off.
The vision of restoring connectivity throughout the watershed sounded amazing, daunting, but possibly achievable.
The alewife is a sea-run fish. The Passamaquoddy people call them the fish that feed all.
For thousands of years, these rivers were a focal point for travel, as a source of food.
It was astronomical. It was a huge run of alewives. The history of alewife and the bagadoos is really analogous to what they've gone through in the whole state of Maine and arguably the Atlantic coast.
Some people think that, oh, the beavers leave a little hole for the fish to go through. No, they don't. There's no little hole.
30 years ago, it was easy to get lobster bait. It's not easy anymore.
It's local organic. How can you beat it?
And the alewife is an example of a keystone species, and when you yank that out of the arch, the rest of it collapses.
What's unique about Maine is there are communities with people that still have a memory of what these fish runs could be like.
There's a system set up to include those fishermen and those community members in the management.
This is people's food, this is people's livelihood, and we need to do something to make it right.
You remove a dam, or you put in a fishway, or you fix a culvert, the alewives respond.
Partnerships are critical to this effort. No one entity could do this alone.
This is really truly a watershed scale effort, which really means that the benefits we get out of it are going to be sustainable into the future.
The whole project just kind of grew exponentially overnight and blossomed into what we have now, which is a complete restoration of all the ponds on the Bagadoos River.
Thanks, Tate. So yeah, hopefully folks enjoyed that. Again, that's just a trailer for a longer version of this this thing we put together to really document these grassroots efforts to really bring together all the different capacities that we are working with to try to move this effort forward as a model to show other folks what it really takes to do that work. And I kind of just leave this as, you know, these networks. This is a new way of thinking. It's not easy to understand, especially for management entities and systems that are sort of ingrained in how they've done things for a long time. And there isn't a simple recipe. As I said earlier, it's different for each species, for each community, each agency. And again, just like any relationship or problem-solving process that needs to be adaptive, it takes time and it takes work, and more importantly, it takes trust, which is, as you know, especially in these days, is hard to build and hard to maintain. But in the end, it's worth it. And so, not ever wasting a chance to shamelessly plug my kids. I'll end on that slide, and I think I saw some Q&A, but I'll turn it over to Paul to sort of facilitate that if he's up for it.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Nice job. Very, very good presentation. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So folks keep typing them in, and we're going to try to get to as many of these as we can. We have several minutes left. I'll first thank Maggie Hunter from DMR, who posted early in the program a link in the chat to the recent alewife landings for 2021 that were reported last week. So thank you, Maggie, for that. Alan Kleinman is asking, Mike, is there any coordination of the herring network with similar ones for salmon and eels, and to what degree?
Yeah, so I will say that was as we sort of ramped this up and got wheels moving and gears turning in this network, that was a big question of ours and of a lot of the participants is, should you just focus on one species when you've got multiple species moving up? You know, one of the cool things about this restoration work and a lot of the management stuff is you restore a stream for alewives, you restore it for sea run cutthroat and elvers and eels and endangered Atlantic salmon and smelt and any kind of fish that utilize those same waterways. So it makes some sense things do get a little bit more unwieldy when you bring in together all those other pieces of management. But I would say, so I guess the answer is not specifically within the network, but I think almost without having to, I think there is some informal coordination, because a lot of the players that are involved in river herring are the same people that are involved. So Down East Salmon Federation is a great example of a group that's very focused on salmon recovery. And that's a huge part of that network. And the Nature Conservancy also working on all anadromous species, and the Department of Marine Resources. So I think the players that are involved create those connections. As far as adding those species related to the network formally, that's we're not there yet. But I think I would say that there's coordination just in the people that are kind of playing in the sandbox of this network. And again, the fact that the fish are all playing in the same wet sandbox, there's coordination there too. So good question.
Thanks, Mike. David Avery has several good questions. I'll try to pull a couple of them together. He made the observation early on that 10 years of data costs money to collect, and are towns supposed to pay for this and to manage and conduct all the research on their own and appropriate money accordingly, or are there grants from state and feds available to help? And similarly, Mike, he asks about, are the state agencies on board with these trusting relationships? I don't know if you can touch on those questions.
So great question on the 10 years and good observation. You're right. I mean, anyone living in a small Maine community or any community that's tried to organize, volunteers just going out for 2 hours on one Sunday a year to do a trash cleanup understands that even that's difficult, let alone the hundreds of hours for 10 years that it takes to pull this together. So you're right, it's an incredible amount of work that needs to be done. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of funding that's specifically available for this in the way that it is around, you can go to a lot of grant programs and find things that say, if you give me $1 million or $500,000, I can take this stream that fish can't get through and turn it into this one that they can. But this is a little bit more ambiguous and not as straightforward as that type of work. And so it's honestly, and Paul probably can tell you more than I can, it's hard to fund this, harder than a lot of those concrete shovel-ready projects. And so that's why we're focused more on looking at the incentives and the incentive kind of systems that are out there naturally in wild fisheries. And so thinking about those landing numbers, those are commercially landed numbers. So the cool thing about fish is that when you're looking at stewardship and numbers of fish, they kind of come with their own little, pocketbooks in there. And if you can sustainably harvest those fisheries, you can create an incentivized system where, if you create a commercial fishery that's sustainably harvestable, and there's money that comes along with harvesting that species, you've created the most bought in steward you can imagine, because if the fishery goes away, the fisherman goes away. And so you wouldn't think that, someone that spends their life catching fish and ending the lives of some fish might be the best people for bringing back fish. But really, it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because they're the ones that have the vested interest of keeping these fisheries going. And so working at state and federal policy levels to stand those commercial fisheries up and say, 10 years is a long time. And if we can tap into those systems of reward and benefit of a commercial fishery, that's how we can keep this going. And so in most of the places that we work, it's the fishermen or even the potential fishermen in some of these fisheries that are the ones that are willing to spend 10 years collecting data for a potential fishery. So it's a long answer, but it was a good question. Something we think about a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'll just make one comment on the fundraising. one idea that we're kicking around with partners these days. Viewers will be aware that the federal government passed an infrastructure bill of over $1 trillion to spend over the next 5 years on various types of infrastructure around the nation. And a significant portion of that is intended for restoration of habitats for different reasons. And of course, we hope a lot of that money will be spent on restoration of our river systems here on the coast of Maine and around the country. As we do the bricks and mortar work with that infrastructure money, we're trying to make the case and remind the investment of federal money that you need to know both the before and after effects of that kind of project. And you need to have community buy-in and understanding of what is the need and the value of that investment, as well as tracking the impact of that investment after the fact. So we see these as kind of ancillary but very important elements of investing in wise restoration. And so we're right now putting together some thought ideas on paper to talk with the funders from NOAA and other places to see how groups like us and community members can participate, but it comes cheap, but it doesn't come for free. And so we think there's maybe a way to bring some of those dollars into these approaches. Let me go to another question here, Mike. John Honea has apparently experience from the West Coast, as do you. So he did early training focused on Pacific salmonids where co-management required equal participation by tribes. Obviously, the situation is different here, but can you talk about any instances of informal or even better formal participation by the tribes in the management of river herring?
Yeah, so you'll probably remember I had the tribal governments were on my kind of diagram of different parties that need to be involved in here. I mean, just like on the West Coast, when you're bringing this local traditional knowledge into this, I think more so than any party, they really do have to play a role in that because of that capacity that comes with that knowledge and that connection with the species. Coming from the West Coast and just starting to get my head around the East Coast, I think we're probably a little behind in some of the policy work that's happened in bringing tribes more officially into that management regime. But and honestly, for the most part in this, tribes are probably treated a little bit more like municipalities than the potential management entities that they could and maybe should provide or be part of. So I can tell you that they are a major player in the networks that we're trying to form and how they're created. But as with, I think anywhere in the country and in probably the world, that's a great question that I think we could be doing a better job on, and probably don't have as good of an answer as I wish I had. Good.
Something related that we're just starting to work on to the east of us. Today's conversation is primarily about this part of Hancock County. But to the east of here, the St. Croix River between the Maine and Canada border, of course, hosted an enormous alewife run back in its day, but it's been plugged up by dams over the years. We're working on a project, a fairly new one, with the tribal community on both sides of the border, the Passamaquoddy out of Sapaic here in Maine, and New Brunswick, and deploying some sensors, some basic water quality sensors to begin collecting some environmental information prior to the removal of one of the dams up in the Calais St. Stephen area that will come out later this summer. And so this is a case where we feel like if we can get in the water early, we can get some before data and then understand changes to water quality after the data. And of course, we have to combine that with other kinds of studies around habitat and habitat restoration, and then monitoring of various species, including alewife. And so we have the tribal community on both sides pretty excited about that, and the funding for the small bit of sensors that we're doing is coming through a part of NOAA through the Nearcoos network. And so there's a big interest up there in both the tribal community as well as the international opportunity of that project. Let's see. I'm going to the chat. We have a few questions here, Mike. David is asking, what are the biggest knowledge gaps that are needed to be filled with regard to herring's life history, its evolution, etc.?
I think one of the biggest pieces that we see is just understanding the variability in between systems. Like I said, we've got, saw the little blue bar that sort of says what's sustainable and what's not. Those are a lot of those, and other metrics that we use are pretty arbitrary and don't take into account the variability between systems and how productive they are. And so that makes our understanding of what is sustainable a little bit arbitrary. And whether or not one pond could create 235 fish per acre, or might be twice that or half that, and what that means, I think are really, and what those requirements of the fish to create more or less from one pond to the other, I think is a big piece. And then there's probably some other pieces around migration patterns when they're in the open ocean that might resolve some of the bycatch issues that we see out there. So those are a couple that really jump out in my head. One other piece that our network is just starting to bite the tip of is that beaver in the room slide I had on there, and really looking at interactions between river herring and beavers, both species of which are at historically wildly different numbers than they have in the past. In beaver's case, there's a lot more than there were 100 years ago. In river herring, there's way fewer than there were 100 years ago, and neither of them are in a natural state, for better or worse. And so that complicates those interactions. And so I think that's another gap that that hopefully we'll be able, and it's one that's doesn't come with as many straightforward numbers and locations and things like that. So trying to be able to tell that story in a way that's practically useful, I think will be interesting moving forward. But there's been a big sort of surge in the number of researchers focused on alewife and river herring over the past just several years. And so that's exciting, and I hope we'll be filling some of those and other gaps soon. Good question.
Thanks, Mike. Got a few more minutes. I'll try to squeeze in a few more of these. Hello to Jim up in the Bagaduce system. Jim appreciated the reference to engaging kids in this, and the images you had were great, Mike, including your own children out there. Of course, this will ultimately perpetuate this kind of a program. Any thoughts on how to continue to engage young people in this?
On how to?
Yeah, or ideas where we're going.
Yeah, I think one of the best things that river herring have going for them is just the sheer shock and awe value of seeing one of these runs. I mean, that fish that you saw my kid holding in the picture, he probably could have reached in and grabbed without his eyes open at 5 years old. And when I don't care how old you are, if you're 5 or 50 or 100, if you can reach into a running stream and pull a fish out, I mean, it's going to blow your mind. And so seeing fish just in these numbers and having them just surge through so quickly really has the effect on people of making them just instantly know how important this is. And so they kind of are their own cheerleader in that aspect. And so I think that's the trick, is just getting people to go out and see these runs is what gets people involved. And so it's kind of a numbers game where we just try to get the most number of people out there as we can, and then folks that show more interest to give them opportunities to be involved. So folks like the Bagaduce Watershed Association and others that Jim's a part of that have members and that also reach out in these ways to other people, really, and the Friends of Walker Pond that we're lucky enough to have there, and specifically the communities, our alewife committees that are willing to go out and interact with students and kids, and really anyone that wants to be part of this, is how we kind of just grow the number of people that just know that the fish are there and that want to be those stewards in the future. So good question, and thanks.
Thanks, Mike. There's a few questions from Ron, David, and Maggie that are all related to life history. I'm going to try to bring them together in one set of questions for you. Ron's asking if there's any experience or information suggesting that the alewives are moving, northward due to climate change, kind of similar to the lobster population. And that comes to another piece that Maggie's asking about fidelity. Do the alewives return to the same stream each year? And David further is asking if the work that you just talked about is happening elsewhere along Maine's coast in terms of successful partnerships and restoration.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that this work is really catching on, not just with our organization, with other organizations. I'd really encourage anyone interested on this, on kind of a Atlanta or Maine coast-wide, to look at our website and also look at the website of the Down East Fisheries Partnership that has a lot of these same partners and analogous organizations that are working on similar projects that are of this scale and in some cases larger in Down East Maine. So that was the Down East Fisheries Partnership. So yes, there's definitely a lot of these kind of efforts going on. The Bagaduce was a great example to be able to be an entire watershed, but not be at a monster kind of St. Croix, Penobscot sort of scale. But the other pieces of that were, some climate change and things like that. There is some evidence that things are starting to change with fish starting to move a little farther north with warming temperatures. Not as really clear cut as these, are more of a migratory species than lobsters are, but there is definitely some shifts happening and some things going on that are really the beginnings of some changes that I think we're starting to see and feel, and initial reactions are that they may be related to climate change, but time will tell. And obviously even with really big species like whales that we're looking at, invertebrates and very small zooplankton and things like that moving can have effect on whales. And so alewives that eat the same size fish or zooplankton can be affected by that. So no doubt there will be some changes in where these fish occur in their life histories. And then I think the other question was about fidelity, where just like salmon, or for the most part, river herring do come back to the same stream or the pond that they were born and reared in. And just like salmon and a lot of other anadromous species, that's a rule, but not there's exceptions to that rule. There's something called a stray rate with each species, where the majority of them will come back to those home ponds to spawn, but a certain number of them will go to different places, and that is just an evolutionary trait that allows them to recolonize a place that maybe was shut off by a beaver dam for a few years, or in the scale of millennia, maybe a volcano went off here and the stream turned to acid, and with these types of evolutionary developments, we're able to go to new places and recolonize places. And so they are a pretty adaptable species in that way. And they're very fecund, which means they lay a lot of eggs, and a stream can go from getting stocked with 600 fish to having hundreds of thousands within a few different life cycles or a few different years. And so they're a pretty incredible species in that aspect. So
very cool. Fascinating. We've come to the end of our hour, but that was great, Mike. A lot of information. I'll just note that David Avery asked a few other fairly good and technical questions, and I'd invite David to reach out to Mike, find us through our website, and continue that engagement if you like. I want to thank everybody for attending today. We will do another one of these next month. We'll hear from one of Mike's partners here at the center. Pat Shepard, our collaborative research specialist, will give an update on another study that we're doing more on the saltwater side of this equation, on what we call our Sentinel survey. Thanks again for being here, and I hope you get to see the watershed moment that you saw a trailer for a moment ago. Again, that event will be on May 21st. I suspect that documentary will be shown elsewhere this summer season, so look out for that. And And best of all, get out in the field very soon, because these fish are beginning to run, and it's a wonderful experience to go and see them in your own community, your own backyard. So thanks again. Visit us if you can. Thank you, Mike. Have a good day.